Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is One Thing More, a continuing conversation through Zionsville United Methodist Church. My name's David Williamson, the senior pastor, and each week we'll have a conversation with different pastors from our church, as well as members and friends, and just to continue the conversation of what we talked about on Sunday. And today I'm joined with my good friend, Chanon Ross, who was my roommate in seminary. So Chanon, why don't you just take a minute and introduce yourself for everyone?
Okay. Well, like Dave said, we've known each other for a long time, before Dave and Jamalyn were married. So that means we go way back, and I have lots of stories that we will not get into unless maybe somebody, want to pay me for them. That's certainly a possibility. But I live with my family out in Plainfield, Morrisville area. So we travel quite a ways to come to church, but find that it is incredibly important for us as a family. And I'm grateful to get to talk with all of you today, and especially with Dave. And this morning's sermon was terrific, as usual, about a really well-known well-worn passage for many of us, right? I mean, the creation story. So what's new there? Dave and I were just talking about, hey, we don't know this story really well, and yet here we are 20 years later and still reading it. So
yeah, good. Real quickly, tell everyone, like, you're married to Chanon, so your wife and you share the same first name.
Yeah.
So, spelled differently. And
so yeah, my name is Chanon Ross. It's spelled Chanon. And my wife's name is also Shannon. And when we got married, she took my last name, so we have the same name. But she spells it the way most people spell it, which is really the right way to spell it. And the normal way to spell it, Shannon. We have 3 children. Zachary and Savannah are just turned 8 this week. And Noah is 15 and a freshman in high school, same age as Dave and Jamalyn's oldest, Margaret.
And tell people what you do.
I am a program officer at Lilly Endowment. So I make grants, and I work in the religion division, making grants to support all kinds of Christian organizations throughout the country. We have hundreds of grants to congregations and theological schools and ministries of all kinds, and work closely with pastors. And I've worked in congregational ministry as well, and worked in theological education. So kind of has been part of my life for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, it was really fun for Jamalyn and I, because Chanon and Chanon are from West Coast. Chanon grew up in Oregon, and they were at Seattle Pacific University. So we were at Duke Divinity School together. And then Chanon had his own kind of journey to Garrett Theological School, so in Chicago, and then worked at Princeton and New Jersey. And when he moved back to Indianapolis, it was kind of like this really exciting, not back for you, it was coming to Indianapolis. But I remember for us, it was like, this is so awesome that, like, 17, or I don't remember how many years we've been removed from seminary at that point, that you were moving in, in the same town as we live. So that was real exciting. Tell them real quickly, before we move into the content, tell everyone the first time we talked, our first conversation. Oh. Remember this?
Well, I was in my early 20s, and it's about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was literally had a suitcase in my hand and was headed out the door to go catch a flight from Oregon to North Carolina to start graduate school. I was living in a 3-bedroom apartment I hadn't yet seen, and there was still one empty bedroom. And so at 6-something in the morning, all of a sudden the phone rang just as I was headed out the door, and it was Dave. And he said, "Hey, I hear you have a room open." And I said, "My understanding is we do." And that's how Dave and I became roommates. He was desperate for some place to sleep, and I was desperate for a roommate. So that's how it started. And what is it now, man? 22 years later now?
Something like that.
Man, we're old.
Yeah.
So,
but it was like 2 days before the semester began, right? Like, it was like
right.
3 days.
Oh, it was, yes.
Yeah.
It was last minute, as per usual. at least
as
back
per
then.
usual. So
You don't do it that way now, I know, but we did back then.
yeah, but it was all part of some master plan, I guess. But it's been
We're not.
yeah.
We just got lucky.
So Shannon and I met at Duke Divinity School, and when we were there, it was definitely heyday for Stanley Ross, who was our professor. I never actually was able to have a class with Dr. Ross, but Shannon definitely did. And one of the things we were very kind of impressed upon us was the idea of story and the importance of story. So as we're starting a series called Long Story Short, I thought I'd ask Shannon, just before we dig into the specific story of creation, just in general, like, can you say a few words, Shannon, about the importance of story and the way it kind of shapes us?
Sure. Well, we in my work at the endowment, one of the things that we spend a lot of time on are programs and projects, ministries that help young people think about their vocation. What are they called to do? So not just occupation, what am I going to do for a career, but vocation. What is my life's meaning and purpose? What am I called to do? Where do my gifts really connect with the world, with the people that I know, with the community that is made my life possible? So we ask young people all the time, what's your story? And I think that's one of the most helpful places for all of us to start is, where have I come from? What's shaped me? What's been good in my life and what's been bad? And to begin to get what you might call a narrative arc to your own life, to think about the journey that you've been on. And a lot of us have to grapple with that when we're younger. But then, when we get a little older at different points too, I think about, for example, when my first child was born, my story took a big turn. And then when I unexpectedly became the father of twins, my story took a big turn. When you got married, when someone important died, when you got or lost a job, when you moved. I've moved, and I think 6 times. I've lived in quite a few states all over the country. So what's your story? What's your narrative arc? And I think when you see the story of your life, and then you begin to see the stories in Scripture, you can discover some of the interconnections, and you begin to see that these stories can shape your story.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that, really struck me, was the idea that all of our individual stories kind of connect to big stories, stories that shape our country. Like, there's a way that we tell a story of our country, and there's a way we tell, the story of history, and the way we tell the story kind of frames what we see and what we don't see, and what we value and what we don't value. And the other thing I love about stories, I don't know how you feel about this, Shannon, but I think stories, they seem to be able to hold together paradoxical truth, that things that may not make a whole lot of rational sense, but a story can hold them together, like the Trinity. Like, nowhere in the Bible do you see the Trinity kind of laid out, and yet you see Father, Son, Holy Spirit in the story. And so from the story, we draw this meaning. And so we end up with this theological claim that God is 3 and God is 1, which sounds contradictory, but it's story that holds that together,
It's really, that's a really great point. And what you said about how we tell the story makes a difference, right? So the story can hold things together that might not otherwise hold together if we tell it right. And there's a real practical, a kind of pragmatic truth in that for our lives, right? Like, you're at different times in our lives, it doesn't feel like there's coherence. And you might ask, well, where is God? Is God even there? Is all this just some thing I've made up or got from somewhere? But yet when we start to tell the story, the tensions that emerge in our lives actually start to make sense. It's not this or that, but God is found woven into the story in the ups and downs.
So let's take a look at the creation story itself, because I think that's a story, and when you talk about weaving together a lot of things, and I tried to, we were kind of talking about, how the creation story, and especially when you see it in context with the Babylonian story that's kind of put out there of Marduk and Tiamat, and the idea of creation and conflict, like the way you tell the story shapes how you see the world. Do you see the world as a place of conflict? Do you see the world as a place of beauty, or like what's behind everything? So, this isn't a very good question, except to say, what are your thoughts, Chanon, as you kind of, what specific reflections do you have on the creation story itself?
Well, I thought, Dave, what you said this morning in the sermon was really quite profound. And as many times in my life as I've read the creation story and thought about the creation story and written about the creation story and taught the creation story, I had never put together the juxtaposition between the Babylonian Marduk story and the creation story, which is the original context for it, right? I mean, that's would have been the big dominant story in which the creation story was originally read. But what you pointed out is that the Marduk story is about creation coming out of conflict. And that story shows up in so many parts of our culture. And the biblical story gives us a different way of seeing the world. It gives us a different way of thinking about conflict. But it also just gives us a different God. It says, when we look at this world, when we understand the narrative arc of our own lives, of other people's lives, of our culture, where does God show up in blessing and praise, as you said this morning, right? In goodness, in an unwavering commitment to creation, and to us, to, as you said this morning, I don't remember which verse it is, but the first time that the word "you" shows up in Scripture, it's directed at us. And so it comes full circle a bit, right? To how we tell the story matters. If we tell the story of Marduk, of conflict, of a kind of perpetual conflict that moves over and over and over again. Some historians, for example, or some at least students of history will sometimes say that, history is just the study of one war to the next, to the next, to the next, one conflict from the next to the next. And yet the biblical story starts someplace else.
Right. Yeah, I can remember when I studied, American history back in high school. It was really just, I always studied was conflict, from one war to the next. Like that was how the story was told. But even to get it down to a personal level, when I think about my own story, it's not necessarily about conflict, but the story that I was kind of steeped in was about work and hard work and grit. And, like I can remember very clearly kind of as a kid being told, like, Dave, don't be out hustled by anyone. Like that was kind of a family value. Like don't let someone else out hustle you. So the story that I kind of, and my mom was a single mom and she had to work very hard, and she kind of impressed on me and my brother this kind of work ethic that, we were, doing laundry and vacuuming and dusting before any of our peers were, at least as far as I can remember. And so the story that kind of got internalized had a lot to do with work. And this is just, you're talking about, what your relationship with God. Like, it's funny, like that story gets internalized, and it's been a blessing in so many ways, like in terms of working hard and finding success and trying to be the best that I can be. Those are all good things. But I look at my relationship with God, and there is like a narrative that often feels like I'm not good enough, that I have to work harder, or it's easier to operate out of guilt and pressure than out of blessing and praise. Like for me, that's what pulls me up short, is kind of thinking, I don't have to earn, God's blessing. I don't have to, and that maybe God's not wanting or needing my work as much as God's wanting my praise and my responsive thanksgiving. That's almost like a whole shift from the narrative that I grew up with.
We pass that story on, right? So you and I both have freshmen in high school, and when you're a freshman, it's no longer dress rehearsal, right? It's not practice anymore. Everything counts. And there's this sense of urgency that parents feel. I feel as a parent, and I used to be a youth pastor, and I saw this urgency rush into the lives of families, rush into kids, and there's something to it. It's absolutely true. I mean, that GPA counts for something for the first time, really ever. That SAT score counts for something. And that list of extracurricular and leadership activities and athletics and drama and band and all these things like begin to put together a profile of you as a person. And then the question immediately arises, well, what's the worth of that profile? But you can see how now all of a sudden we're talking about a story. We're talking about a narrative arc of someone's life, and they're 14, 15 years old, and parents see this happen to their kids. And it's how the broader context of our lives begins to shape our own children. And sometimes we don't see it in ourselves as easily as we can see it in our kids. When we see it in our kids, then our anxiety comes in, then our worry comes in. And I think that's a lot of why we will, like you were just saying, will immediately rush to, well, what about hard work, and how are you going to make it? And, are you actually going to get out of here? Or are you going to live with me forever? Something, right? And so there's some, one of the things that I love about this is how tangible it is, right? Like as a parent, those are real concerns that I have, and I don't have them, occasionally. I have them pretty much all the time. I carry them with me. I carry them in my heart. And yet there's a different story that I can provide for my kids at the same time, and say, hey, these things are realities. I can't change everything about the culture, but I can't create, but I can find in scripture, I can find in the gospel and in the life of our faith community, a different way to think about ourselves, and to say, hey, that SAT number is just a number. And I'll go on record right now, I took the SAT 4 times and did worse on it every time. And my score was so bad that my English teacher thought something had just gone terribly wrong. And I don't remember, it was really low percentile, like 30, 40%. They were just like, what are you going to do with your life? And are you going to go anywhere? Are you going to make anything of yourself? Like, you don't have to. You just are.
Yeah.
The very image of God. That's the Genesis 1 story that you preached this morning. We just are. And it's a gift. And God doesn't look for anything from us but praise, which is not that God needs our praise, but that it's the appropriate response when you've received such an amazing gift.
Yeah, I think about it with my kids a lot too, Shannon. And just the other day I was thinking about, because I was that same thing, that trigger of grades, and you could just play it out, you know, what school they go to and where, you know, where they end up in life. And there's a part of me is like, I hope at some point my kids see the life for what it is, or that it's, and what I most want for my kids is that, I mean, it sounds silly, but I just say, God, I want my kids to be able to give and receive love, and to live in peace with themselves and peace with others, and feel a sense of purpose and vocation, that they offer something to the world and those around them. But those are different. That's a different way of framing the story than than Drive and Got to Be the Best, and and your worth depends on it.
And the story that our kids get, and it's not that we tell them the story, it's just that they pick it up because it's in the air that we breathe, right? Is, you know, you got to work hard in your classes so that you can get the best GPA you can, so that you can do the best on the scores that you can, so that you get in the right college, so that you can go to the right graduate school, so you get the right job, so you can marry the right person and live in the right place and get the right golden retriever in your backyard. There's just this sort of build, and it's all hogwash, right? We know that it is.
Right. But it's easy to buy into that story because it's so dominant.
Oh, yeah, it's hard. It's hard to escape. So, you know, I think that there are, when we actually look, well, I was going to say, young people, it's hard to be young. And I think for those of us, you know, who might know young people, especially in their 20s or in their late teens, being young is to bear the burden of potential. And potential is exciting, right? I mean, you can remember the potential of being young, of the autonomy, the freedom. You're not
all the doors that are unopened.
Yeah. But it's also an enormous burden because it's a story that's yet to be written, right? It's a young person has a story to write. And what is that story going to be? And everybody wants to know, it seems, and yet also doesn't seem to care. It's this really tough tension. You know, who cares about me? And my life yet needs to somehow be significant. And so I think that one of the things that we can, those of us who are older, can do is reflect on how that may have shaped us, how it shapes young people, our kids maybe, but then recognize that actually life doesn't look anything, none of our lives look like that. I don't know anyone, I've never met anyone whose life just sort of goes like this. It goes like this.
Yeah.
And you find yourself with things that are stuck into your story that don't belong there. So then the question is, okay, how do I give those up? To whom do I give them? And I think this is to be able to give them to God. To be able to give them to God by gathering with other people and saying, hey, I don't know how this got in here, but can you all help me get it out? And then someone else says, I got one of those too. I need that out. And it's that kind of mutuality and relationship that helps us figure out what our real story is and what it isn't.
Right. And sometimes out doesn't mean like out, like cast out, but sometimes it just means on the table and worked through and acknowledged and integrated with the rest of my story. Like it's not something I'm hiding, but it's integrated into a healthy whole.
Hey, or something that has to come in.
Yeah.
Something that it's been there the whole time, but I never realized, like some kind of minor character or minor theme that really is a major character and a major theme. Or, I mean, we can play the analogy of story out, but you can't figure that stuff out for yourself, right? Like even the best storytellers need someone else to read the story and tell them what it sounds like. You don't know what it looks like when you're the author. Somebody's got to read it. You've got to put it out and know.
So to shift for a second, because we only have a couple minutes left, you and I were also talking about science and the connection between science and the creation story in particular. I mean, this is a text that has often been at loggerheads with and part of it's depending on how do we interpret the creation story. But you said something that I found really profound about, even the Big Bang Theory, how we look at that is almost like a Rorschach test. So say a little more about that.
Oh, well, I thought what you were talking about this morning in your sermon was really helpful. And my son is a promising young scientist. I kid you not, right now, as we speak, there's a chemistry experiment going on in my garage. There's a distillation. I don't know what it all is. But he is, as we walked into the service this morning, he said something to the effect of, I love chemistry because it gets you so close to creation. You're literally working with these elements. Well, when you were talking about the Big Bang this morning, and we can, that's just a scientific fact, right? It's a set of realities that we've discovered about the universe. And it's amazing when you actually I love cosmology. And when you start to think about the moments of creation, is it a violent bang or is it an awe-inspiring, beautiful event, right? Well, that all depends on how you see it. And maybe how you see it depends on what's going on inside of you. And I suspect that many of the reasons that at least scientists that I know, study science is because of how awe-inspiring the universe really is. From the smallest quantum particles to the biggest galaxies and everything in between. It's so awe-inspiring. And somewhere in there's praise going on. That feels, and to be awed is to praise, whether consciously or unconsciously, to discover something about the world, the physical world, and to just be drawn even more into it, to pursue it, to spend a career chasing it down. That's to be awed, that's to praise.
Yeah, which I think is a perfect way for us to end. So I just want to say thanks, Chanon, for giving us this time, and go check on the chemistry experiment. Those things can go
bad
sideways.
No, we've had them go bad.
All right. Well, thanks, Chanon.
All right.
And I hope everyone listening enjoyed this. And this is something we'll start doing every week. And log on and hear different pastors and people just kind of talking about the story of God and how it impacts with our story too. Have a great week, everybody.